Today I'm going to be sharing about quilting with leather. Whether you want to make traditional quilt blocks, do something more modern, I'm going to share with you my tips and tricks and also the tools that I use, some of which might be surprising to you, of how I'm able to make these great quilts with leather. The leather industry sucks, right? Yeah. So why am I recommending that you work with leather? Well, because I'm recommending that you work with secondhand leather. Once leather's there, do we want it to end up in a landfill? I don't. I would love to help it become something amazing that someone will cherish and love. So of course, I'm going to recommend that you source your leather secondhand. I volunteer at a creative reuse center, and that is my #1 recommendation of where to find secondhand leather. In the video notes, there will be a link to this resource. It's a map that maps creative reuse centers all over the country. If you're in an area that has a lot of interior design, you are more likely to find leather secondhand. There's so much leather used in the interior design industry. You'll also find leather in your closet or at a thrift store. Old leather jackets are great to use, especially because the leather's already softened up a little bit. Bags, any type of leather clothes are great for upcycling. You just really need to look at the weight. Okay, let's talk about weight. So I'm not going to talk ounces. Honestly, I don't know what all of these are. And if you're buying this stuff secondhand, I doubt you do either, or it would be very helpful to you. Instead, I'm going to kind of show you how it feels, how it drapes, so you can kind of see. Now, generally, the type of leather that I look for is something that has movement to it, on the lighter side, up to things that are so light that they almost seem like just a normal fabric. Because you can always make things heavier, you can't make things lighter. That being said, again, depending on what you're making, if you're making a quilted bag, you may want leather that's heavier for the straps or for little details. If you're doing applique, you can get leather of any thickness or weight because you aren't gonna turn it, you're just gonna sew it down. I still avoid things that are too heavy though, because they're less versatile. So what weight should you use? Well, that completely depends on what type of project you're gonna do. If you wanna make a more traditional quilt block, something that's pieced together, and you're going to have a lot of seams on the back, there's gonna be folds, then you wanna use something that's a lot lighter weight. Earlier I mentioned applique. And here's an example of using slightly heavier weight leather to do a raw edge applique. Since, again, the edges don't have to be turned under, they just get stitched down, it is a great way to use heavier weights. In fact, one of my absolute favorite ways to make appliques is with leather scraps. Now, the only thing you need to be aware of is it can be a little bit hard to use pencils to mark on the back of leather. So generally, if I want to make shapes, rather than trying to use a pencil, which as you can see does not work so well, I'll actually just use a normal pen or marker because the ink will not go through to the front side. But of course, you want to test it before you do this. Now, before we move on to prepping and sewing with leather, there's something you need to think about if you're a quilter when it comes to weight. And that is seam allowance. The lighter the weight, the easier it is to use a narrow seam allowance because it will fold really easily. That's why with normal, say, quilting cottons, you can use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you start to get to these thicker weights, it is very hard to manage those little narrow seam allowances. The minute you get to a place where you have multiple areas coming together and folding. So I will generally, with a heavier weight, increase my seam allowance, maybe up to like a 1/2 inch or more, and that will make it easier to manage.